There was a famous man known throughout the world. His name was widely recognized. He was someone uncontrollable, a once renowned swordmaster now confined to his room. He was also known as a man out of his mind, Count Perdium's useless oldest son, Ghislain Perdium. Then, there was a person who couldn't believe he had been defeated by the man in the rumors. He couldn't comprehend that he, the best knight of the North, had just been beaten like that. He wanted to ask why he had been defeated by such a garbage human being. A robed figure then addressed the knight, saying he must be feeling pretty warm and cozy right now. The robed man told the knight he had invested a lot of money into setting that trap. The knight, clad in armor and a robe, approached him, carrying a large battle axe. The robed man asked the knight if he liked what he had prepared. That man in armor was, in fact, Ghislain Perdium. The knight, shocked, said that he must be the trash Ghislain. He asked what kind of trap it was and whether Ghislain was telling him that he had known of his plans all along. Ghislain replied that it wasn't just that he knew that simple plan of the knight and his allies. He said he also knew how many were in the knight's army, who the spies were, and who had helped the knight with reinforcements. Ghislain told the knight that he had known everything from the start. The knight felt as though he had been in Ghislain's palm from the very beginning. In disbelief, the knight shouted, claiming there was no way Ghislain could have done that, as he had always been a hidden ace. He demanded to know how someone like Ghislain, who was known as trash, could dare to do such a thing. But before the knight could continue spouting nonsense, Ghislain kicked him in the face, knocking him unconscious, and told him to shut his mouth. Ghislain then threw away his helmet. He declared that they could try invading his territory as many times as they wanted, but he assured that he would be the one to win the war next time and every time after that. He asked the unconscious knight if he knew why Ghislain was so certain of victory. Ghislain said it was because he had all their plans in his mind. A year ago, in the Luthania kingdom near the Perdium estate, Ghislain awoke, panting heavily, shaking, and staring at his body. He started questioning what had just happened, clutching his neck, sweating, and pale. He wondered if he was still alive. He couldn't believe it because something had just happened to him. A sword had flown into the air after being parried by another warrior, falling to the ground. Two strong warriors had been fighting, and one seemed to have already lost. It was Ghislain, swearing, on the verge of defeat. But it didn't end there, as he took another slash to his body. Ghislain's enemy smiled at him. He told Ghislain that this must be how it ends, that Ghislain Perdium, once known as the Mercenary King and one of the continent's strongest men, had lost. He said the war was already over. This man was Idun, one of the continent's top 7 men, like Ghislain, known as the Noble Knight. Idun pointed his sword at Ghislain and asked if he had any last words before being killed. Ghislain said there were none, but he told Idun it was a shame he couldn't fulfill his revenge. With a glare, his face wounded and beaten, Ghislain told Idun to die, calling him a sickening bastard. Idun smirked, telling Ghislain he had been too arrogant. While pointing his sword at him, Idun mentioned that he hadn't expected Ghislain to be the oldest son of the fallen Perdium household. He then asked Ghislain if he had left his family after his sister died. This caught Ghislain's attention. Glaring at Idun, he demanded to know how he knew that, considering they were from different kingdoms. Smiling evilly, Idun replied that of course, he knew. He revealed that he had worked long and hard to track Ghislain down because they had worked with the Delphini household to bring down Ghislain's family. Hearing that this bastard was part of the fall of his family caught the attention of the dying MC. His expression changed as he began questioning in his mind if there were other people involved in that incident besides Duke Dufine's household. Idun said that there was no point in explaining further since Ghislain would be dead soon. He told Ghislain to just accept his fate. This struck a nerve in Ghislain, and he shouted, calling Idun a bastard, telling him that he would never forgive him. Idun looked at him and said it was fine if Ghislain didn't forgive him, then proceeded to behead him. At the moment he was decapitated by the enemy, Ghislain held his neck, because even after that, he was still alive in that place, with his head on his shoulders. Ghislain started touching his face, wondering if all that had happened was a hallucination. He also noticed that he appeared to be in his younger self. He looked around the room, asking if he had been taken captive and used as a lab rat by the mages or something. He thought the mages were those arrogant bastards who had done that to him, and he planned to make them regret keeping him alive. Then, someone entered his resting place, calling him young master. It was one of the Perdium soldiers, Ricardo. Ricardo told his master to please come out since he knew his young master was already awake. Suddenly, a sword was pointed at Ricardo's neck, with Ghislain holding it. Ghislain told Ricardo that he would let him live if he answered all his questions, but he also planned not to let him leave alive. Ricardo, sweating, looked back at his master, doing something dangerous. He sighed deeply and said that what Ghislain had done was already crossing the line. Ghislain questioned why Ricardo didn't seem worried or scared. He wondered what was with Ricardo's reaction since he was being threatened. Ghislain asked Ricardo what he was talking about. Ricardo wiped his hand to push Ghislain away and said that Ghislain was just tired from his tantrum earlier and had fallen asleep. Ghislain began to question if that really happened. Ricardo, still holding his neck, asked his young master if he had forgotten everything after taking a nap. Ricardo told him that he had thrown a tantrum about how he was going to command the group to raid the orcs. Ghislain was confused, asking what Ricardo meant about the orcs and what he meant by saying he threw a tantrum. He told Ricardo that everything he was saying was nonsense. Ricardo pulled out his bag and told Ghislain that he needed to get his stuff together because people were waiting. Ghislain asked what this stuff was about and where they were going. Ricardo walked past him, saying there was no place they could go except the Perdium estate. Hearing this shocked Ghislain, and he asked himself what Ricardo meant. He grabbed the soldier and asked him to repeat where they were going. Ricardo, confused, asked for clarification. Ghislain asked if he meant the estate of Perdium, the fallen Perdium estate. Ghislain walked to the top of a cliff and looked at the territory of Perdium, which had once fallen in the life he had as a mercenary. Although he couldn't believe it at first, now that he had seen it firsthand, he was sure it was indeed the Perdium estate. He questioned why it was still standing because he had seen it reduced to ashes back then. Ricardo whispered to Ghislain, asking if he had had a terrible nightmare or something. He told Ghislain that calling his own household a fallen one would get him kicked out if the Count heard that. Ghislain pinched his cheeks, wondering if he was dreaming. But since he felt pain this time, he guessed it was reality. However, Ricardo thought of him as something weird. Ghislain thought to himself, a younger face, the estate in its original state. This could only mean one thing: he had traveled back to the past. Ghislain remembered that his younger self resented their household. His immaturity, born from feeling inferior, led to trouble, and as time passed, more people from the household began avoiding him. Unable to withstand the criticism, Ghislain ran away from home. Several years later, he became a mercenary. He survived countless battles, built up his skills, and made a name for himself. He returned to the Perdium County to make up for his past mistakes, but he could only fall to his knees as he saw his household had already been crushed to dust. For him, in that moment, he lost everything. But right now, it was all still here. All the people he held dear were still there. He laughed silently, thinking he couldn't believe this was reality. He wanted to sing with joy, but he quickly became serious, thinking it was still too early to rejoice. Ghislain looked at Ricardo and remembered that Ricardo told him they were there to raid the orcs. Ghislain also remembered this day vividly, as he could never forget it. This was the day most of the people in the raid squad would die. In Ghislain's past life, he had followed the orc raid squad in an attempt to make a name for himself. At that time, the report had said there were only 3 orcs. Ghislain thought it would be easy enough for someone like him, who had no experience commanding a squad. But when they arrived, there were more than 20 orcs. Almost all of them ended up dying because of his stubbornness and desire to command the squad. Ghislain prepared himself for the battle, but Ricardo was still doubting his young master. For Ghislain, it was still doable enough since the orcs didn't really have a strategy. The problem was whether the others would trust him, as they all thought he was some useless bastard. Suddenly, he heard something. It was the sound of the watchtower being destroyed. The watchtower began to fall, crashing to the ground, and the guards started panicking. One guard shouted that the orcs were here. They all began shouting that the orcs had arrived. Orcs that resembled warlords began charging at the unprepared guards. Ghislain questioned why they had arrived already. He wondered if the orcs had moved this quickly in his past life as well. The orcs began attacking, and the soldiers on the front line, unprepared, were beaten down by the monsters. Each attack from an orc was disastrous. One soldier shouted for everyone to get into formation. The raid squad commander, Scoven, ran as fast as he could when he heard the attack. He told everyone not to panic and to form a defensive formation. However, one downward slash from an orc sent many soldiers flying through the air, leaving them beaten. Even the squad commander was pushed back by the attack. Skoven could only curse in his mind because of the sudden attack. He thought they had let their guard down, as they were ambushed while unprepared. But what alarmed him most was that there were far more orcs than had been reported. He feared that at this rate, they were all going to die. Then someone shouted the commander's name, catching his attention as he was deep in thought. That person told him something was behind him. It was an orc, ready to deliver a full downward slash on the commander. Suddenly, there was an explosion on the ground. Someone had jumped with full force, causing the ground to explode. The commander was confused as a hand touched his shoulder, and he had no idea who it was. It was Ghislain, who had jumped and pushed the commander away, rushing toward the orc that was about to attack. The commander was confused about how that happened. It was their young master who was about to face the large orc's attack head-on without even any equipment. But the next thing that happened was the orc being cut into pieces. The right side of the orc was cut down with an upper slash from the MC. All of them were shocked, looking at the well-known useless master performing such a crazy stunt. In the end, the orc coughed up blood and ended up dead. The MC just stood there, watching the orc slowly die. Then the MC started rotating his sword, feeling annoyed at this point. He said that he guessed he still couldn't use mana at this time. He mentioned that he wished he had returned to the past earlier than this timeline. Ghislain called out to Skoven, who was still confused. Ghislain asked if he was the commander right now. Ghislain extended his hand and told Commander Skoven to give it to him. Skoven, confused, asked the young master's pardon. Ghislain clarified that what he wanted was the commander's rights. He told the commander to hand over the right to command. Skoven started to question in his mind what the young master meant and if he was really sure about asking for the right to command. Skoven knew that the young master was considered an idiot, but asking for command when the lives of soldiers were at stake was something else entirely. Commander Skoven refused, saying he couldn't give it to him. Ghislain, disappointed, asked, "What?" Skoven walked away, asking the young master if he thought this was some kind of game. Skoven said that even though he was the young master, he couldn't give up the authority that the Lord had given him so easily. Ghislain stayed silent, listening to the commander's rant. He was feeling annoyed, but Ghislain understood if an idiot had come up to him asking for command, he would have reacted the same way. Before they could discuss it further, another orc appeared, wild and ready to slaughter any human it encountered. Skoven moved in front of the MC and told him to fall back. He assured Ghislain that he would take care of everything and that Ghislain was still too inexperienced to lead the troops. Ghislain, now serious about fighting, said there was no other choice but to take action. Commander Skoven was pushed aside by the MC, who then threw his sword toward the approaching orc. The commander, shocked by this, grabbed Ghislain's collar and angrily shouted, asking what he thought he was doing. But as they argued during the heat of battle, Skoven suddenly remembered the orc beside them. To his shock, the orc had a sword stuck in its head, the sword thrown by the MC. The orc was dead with just that one throw, a perfect headshot from the MC. The commander was confused and couldn't believe what had just happened. He began to question how the young master had hit the orc's weak spot. Ghislain then asked Skoven if he knew what the most important thing in battle was. Commander Skoven, silent and bewildered, didn't respond. Meanwhile, the soldiers were losing morale, gripped by fear as the large number of orcs attacked. Ghislain told the commander that there was no hope of winning a battle if their troops were filled with fear. He emphasized that they needed to gain momentum in this fight. The MC became wild, as if possessed by the god of war. He rushed forward, pulling his sword from the head of the dead orc while charging. This gave him the momentum to jump high into the air. As he descended, he aimed a stab at an orc in the midst of the soldiers, who were busy defending while being pushed back. As Ghislain landed, he stabbed the orc in the head, killing it instantly. The soldiers, including Ricardo, were shocked. The captain was speechless at this turn of events. Ghislain then pulled his sword from the head of the dead orc. Then he shouted, telling the orcs to come at him because he would kill them all. Ghislain gained the attention of all the orcs, but he didn't back down and faced them head-on. Many orcs tried to attack him, but none of their strikes hit the MC. Instead, the MC was the one who managed to land blows on the critical parts of those monsters. One orc tried to slash at him, but instead of landing a hit, the orc's hand was the one that fell off from the strike of the MC's sword. As the bodies of the orcs continued to fall, the commander stood watching from the side, still in awe. He started to question if he was dreaming. Seeing Ghislain cut down the heads of those orcs made it even more unbelievable. He thought to himself, as a mana user, it was hard for him to do anything. He began to wonder how his skinny young master was doing all of this. But looking at his master, he could already tell he was exhausted. However, Commander Scoven noticed that Ghislain was using the smallest of movements to dodge attacks and was using his swordsmanship to strike at their weak spots. Commander Scoven could only think of one thing: Ghislain was like a manaless sword master. But he was still sweating at the thought, wondering if Ghislain was something even greater. Ghislain shouted, asking the orcs if that was all they had because he wasn't even warmed up yet. He started running after that taunt. Ghislain remarked that those orcs weren't living up to their reputation as a warrior species. Ricardo shouted, telling the soldiers that all the orcs were charging at the young master. One soldier asked if Ghislain was running away. Ricardo, worried about the young master, started calling the commander, maybe waiting for his command. But the commander stood like a statue, frozen in place, questioning in his mind what Ghislain was thinking. He started sweating even more because he didn't know what to do, and he didn't understand the actions of their young master. For Commander Scoven, running into the group of orcs and drawing their attention was good, but running away now was something he couldn't understand. What baffled him more was that the young master was running toward the edge of a cliff. Then, Scoven started to realize what the young master was planning, which made him sweat more because it was different from what he had expected. Commander Scoven looked at his soldiers. He called them and told his troops to raise a shield wall. Commander Scoven said they would follow the first sun. Meanwhile, Ghislain was still running away, with the orcs chasing him. Ghislain looked back and pointed his sword at the orcs. Ghislain thought that if Scoven, the commander, was skilled, he would have already realized what his plans were. Ghislain would have preferred to slice all the orcs down himself, but his useless stamina wouldn't be able to handle it. Still, he smiled because even then, this should be enough for him to manage. While the orcs were focused on fighting Ghislain and ganging up on him, a marching sound caught their attention as it sounds like soldiers are preparing for a counterattack. The soldiers were already raising their shields and pointing their spears, resembling Spartans performing a phalanx formation. Ghislain smiled, saying it was all perfect. Then, while the orcs' attention was on the soldiers, Ghislain jumped off the cliff like a suicidal man. For him, he would leave the troops and the decisions to Commander Scoven now. Scoven began leading the troops, just as Ghislain had expected. He ordered the soldiers to push the orcs toward the cliff, and they rushed at the orcs with all their strength. I don't know how they managed to push those large, muscular orcs, but they shouted as they pushed, perhaps to boost the soldiers' morale. In the end, they succeeded in pushing the orcs off the cliff. The orcs screamed as they fell, and when they hit the ground, they were all dead from the impact. The soldiers panted heavily after the battle, celebrating that they had done it. They had killed all the orcs. Meanwhile, Commander Scoven was shouting, calling out for their young master, who had fallen off the cliff. Ghislain, however, was holding onto the cliff walls, having thrust his sword into the rock to stop his fall. He was holding on for too long with just one hand. He smiled, looking at Scoven. Scoven was speechless, but as he realized the young master was okay, he slowly smiled. He offered his hand and told the young master to grab it, but Ghislain said he couldn't hold on any longer and released his hand from the handle of the sword. In the end, he fell. The soldiers, including Commander Scoven and Ricardo, began shouting, calling for the young master. Then someone called out to Ghislain, referring to him as an older brother or Appa. Ghislain was confused and said the girl's name. Her name was Elena. Fragments of bad memories began surfacing in Ghislain's mind as he stood there silently. He was silent and speechless, as those memories must be affecting his mental state. As he looked at the fragments, he realized they were memories of Elena, his younger sister. Then Elena grabbed his arm, startling Ghislain. Elena was crying, looking pitiful at that moment. She told her older brother that they needed to go together. Ghislain woke up from that bad dream, sweating. He seemed to be in an infirmary. He looked at his hand, thinking he was alive this time and that the soldiers had managed to save him. He slowly stood up, questioning whether it was a dream, but he was alarmed when he felt an intense pain in his body. He sighed deeply, feeling the pain, and said his whole body hurt. He thought it must be the consequence of pushing his body to the limit. Then, his maidservant came in, happy that her young master was awake. Ghislain was a bit confused and called her name. The maidservant name was Belinda. The maidservant Belinda, who was carrying a towel, sighed and said she had been so worried about the young master. She reminded him that she had once told him he should have let the soldiers handle the orcs. Suddenly, Ghislain ran to Belinda and hugged her, leaving her speechless. Belinda asked her young master what he was doing and if she had done something wrong. Ghislain said she had done nothing wrong and that he was just glad to see her. Belinda had been Ghislain's personal tutor. Since he was young, she was the only one who stayed by his side despite his idiotic antics. But after his family fell to ruin and she went missing, Ghislain had not been able to see her again. He never thought he would get to see her like this. Belinda, confused, asked why he was so happy when they saw each other every day. But this time, Ghislain hardened his resolve. Since Belinda was one of the people he trusted the most, he planned to tell her the truth. Ghislain grabbed Belinda's shoulder and told her to listen carefully. He told her that a catastrophe would soon strike Perdium. Confused, Belinda asked him what he was talking about. With a serious face, Ghislain told Belinda that he had died and come back to life. Belinda, slightly confused, agreed, saying she was sure the orcs had almost killed him. Ghislain clarified that wasn't what he meant, but Belinda continued fixing his bed. She told him that if he was aware, he was the one that is in great danger, not the Perdium territory. Belinda kept nagging Ghislain with a long stream of words, making him think that she didn't believe him. He guessed that what he said wouldn't work. Then Belinda asked Ghislain what he was going to do if he was too injured to go to the festival. This caught Ghislain's attention, and he asked Belinda what she meant by the festival. She reminded him, asking if he had already forgotten about it. She told him that Lady Elena had been waiting for the day to go to the festival with him. Belinda said it would be a great chance for the two of them to become close again, and then she started laughing. Ghislain could only agree as he grabbed the picture of him and Elena. He thought Belinda was right, there was always a festival around this time of year. In his past life, Ghislain hadn't had time to enjoy festivals because of his traumatic experiences. Ghislain asked Belinda how long it would be until the festival started. She calculated it and told him it would be held next week, so he had about a week left. Ghislain began thinking about what he would do for a week. Then, someone slowly came in. It was Elena. She called him Appa and asked if he was inside. Ghislain looked back in her direction with a serious expression. This was the day that changed Ghislain's life. The memory in which Elena asked him to go with her, the memory that continued to haunt him. Because 1 week later, Elena was going to die.